There are places in the Texas desert that time has forgotten. Houses that stand alone, half buried in dust, waiting for someone who will never return. Eli was the first to see it. An old farmhouse about 200 yards off the dirt road, half hidden behind a few dried-out mesquite trees. Mark wanted to keep driving, but Eli slowed the truck. Something about that place didn't feel right. The building still stood solid. No holes in the roof, no walls caved in, just sitting there, untouched. That didn't happen out here. Abandoned houses were always ripped apart by the wind, by time, by coyotes and drifters. But this one looked preserved. They needed water. The sun was burning high and their canteens were nearly dry. They figured they'd just step inside, refill, and move on. The wooden door creaked but opened easily. Inside, the air was still and heavy, like no one had breathed there in decades. Everything was in place. Pots hung on the wall. Folded clothes sat on a chair. A table was set with plates covered in dust, as if the people had stepped out for a minute and never come back. Mark walked slowly, brushing his fingers over the furniture. Everything was old, real old, but untouched. Eli noticed scratches in the dirt floor, lines carved by something heavy being dragged. He followed them to a door at the back that led out to the yard. That's when they heard it. Voices, low and muffled, coming from outside. Not the wind, not animals. Men. Eli signaled Mark to keep quiet. They crept to the window, no glass, just a frame, and peeked out. Fresh horse tracks crisscrossed the yard. Dozens of them. The voices were getting closer. Coming straight for the house, Eli's pulse quickened. Who the hell were they? Why here? Mark whispered they should get out, but it was too late. The footsteps were already close. Running now would expose them in the open field. Eli scanned the small room for a hiding spot. The place was tiny, just a few rooms, nowhere safe. The men outside were talking clearer now, at least 3, maybe 4. One said he was sure this was the place. Another asked if the old man had lied. Then a deep, gravelly voice told them to shut up and start searching. Eli and Mark exchanged a look. They weren't alone. Whoever these men were, they weren't just passing through. They were looking for something. And from the sound of it, they wouldn't tolerate intruders. Eli pulled Mark behind a tall wooden cabinet in the corner. They crouched on the dirt floor, holding their breath. The front door burst open. Heavy boots stomped across the floorboards. Metal clinked at their belts. Guns. The rough voice barked orders. 2 to the back, 2 to search the room. Eli squeezed his eyes shut. If they looked behind the cabinet, it was over. But the men were impatient. Sloppy. They kicked things around, cracked open old trunks, cursed under their breath. After a few minutes, the leader growled that this was a waste of time. Maybe the old man had lied about the location. He told his crew to check the yard, then they'd move on. Bootsteps retreated. The back door creaked open. Eli waited until the noise faded. Then motioned to Mark. They had to leave. Now. They slipped out the front while the others searched behind the house, but curiosity burned in Eli's gut. What were those men after? Why this house? They circled wide, staying low behind the brush, watching from a distance. The men were pacing the yard, scanning the dirt for signs, pointing at the ground. Eli's eyes caught a patch near the rear fence. Thinner weeds, darker soil. Something had been disturbed there. The men hadn't noticed. They were looking the wrong way. When the 4 finally went back inside, Eli made his move. He waited until it was silent, then hurried straight to that patch. Mark followed, nervous, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. Eli knelt and started digging with his hands. The dirt was loose. Someone had dug here before. Not recently, but not too long ago either. They clawed through the dry earth until Eli's fingers struck something hard. Clay. A large earthen jar sealed tight with dried leather cords. It was heavy when he lifted it out. He cut the cords with his pocket knife. Inside, coins, silver, gold, rings, chains, a fortune. But at the bottom lay something else. A folded yellowed piece of paper. Eli handed it to Mark, who could read better. Mark opened it carefully. His face changed as he read. Eyes narrowing, voice low. It was a letter. The house had once belonged to a family of farmers, good people. A powerful ranch owner had forged fake debts to steal their land. When they refused to leave, he sent armed men, gave them a deadline, leave or die. The family buried their savings and fled. The letter asked that whoever found it seek out their descendants. It listed names: Mary Doras, Jack Perry, Dry Lake. Mark was still reading when they heard the voices again. The men were coming back, and this time heading straight toward them. Eli looked up. 4 men stood at the edge of the yard, staring right at them. The leader was huge, bearded, wearing a cracked leather hat. A scar ran from his eye to his mouth. Eli recognized the look: quiet, dangerous authority. The kind of man people obeyed without question. He stepped down slowly, the others fanning out behind him. Said his name was Ben Caldwell, that he worked for the Caldwell family, and that this house, this land, and everything buried here belonged to his boss. Eli and Mark, he said, had just made a big mistake walking into a place they didn't belong. Eli rose, clutching the jar to his chest. Mark stood beside him, hands shaking. Ben stopped a few yards away, grinning when he saw the jar. Said they'd been searching for it for years, that the old ranch hand who'd once worked this property had confessed on his deathbed that pots of gold were buried here. And now they'd finally found it. Eli said it wasn't theirs, that there was a letter explaining everything, that the treasure belonged to a family who'd been driven out unjustly. Ben laughed. Said it didn't matter what was written on some old paper. What mattered was power. And power, he said, had always belonged to the Caldwells. He held out his hand. Ordered Eli to hand over the jar. Eli stepped back. Mark glanced around. They were surrounded. The others had spread out, blocking every way out. Ben's patience snapped. He made a sharp motion. 2 of his men moved forward. That's when Mark acted, grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it in one man's eyes. The guy yelled, blinded. Eli shoved the other aside and they ran. Ben shouted orders. Gunfire cracked. Warning shots meant to scare, not hit. They didn't stop running. They vaulted the low stone fence and sprinted toward the sparse trees. Kept running until their legs burned, until the shots faded behind them. They stopped under a dead mesquite, gasping for breath. Mark's face was red, sweat dripping. Eli still clutched the heavy jar against his chest. No one was following yet, but they both knew Ben wouldn't quit. Men like him never did. Mark asked what they'd do now. Eli pulled the folded letter from his pocket, looked at the names again. Mary Dora's, Dry Lake. He said they'd do what the letter asked, find the descendants, return what was theirs. Mark stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Said Ben and his men would kill them if they were caught. They should run far away. Eli shook his head. Said if they ran, Ben would keep hunting. Eventually he'd find that family and do to them what the Caldwells had always done. The only chance was to get there first. Find the descendants, give them the truth, and hope it was enough to save them all. They walked through the night. The desert was dangerous in the dark, but staying still was worse. Ben had horses, men, and time. Eli carried the jar under his arm. Mark stumbled behind him, cursing the madness of what they were doing. Said they should have handed it over, that no treasure was worth dying for. Eli didn't answer, just kept walking. Mark shouted after him, saying they were running toward death, that Ben would find them eventually, and when he did, he wouldn't leave witnesses. Eli stopped, turned to him, voice low but steady. If you want to go back and hand it to him, go ahead. But you know men like Ben. They don't leave witnesses either way. Even if they handed everything over, they wouldn't leave alive. The only chance was to finish what they'd started. Find the descendants, make the story public, let the world know. That way, Ben Caldwell couldn't just make them disappear quietly. Mark stayed silent for a while, jaw tight. He knew Eli was right. He muttered a curse under his breath and kept walking. By dawn, they spotted smoke on the horizon. A small desert town, a few scattered houses, a water tower in the distance. Eli suggested going around it, but Mark shook his head. They needed water, food. They wouldn't last another day without both. They entered cautiously. The place was quiet, too quiet. A few people walked along the dusty main street. Kids played near an old hand pump by the well. They went into a general store, a narrow room filled with canned goods, ropes, and dust. Behind the counter stood an old man, thin and weathered, eyes sharp with suspicion. He looked at them like he could read their story just from their faces. Eli asked for bread and jerky, paid with a small coin he had left. The old man turned the coin over in his hand, then looked up. "Where are you boys coming from?" he asked. Eli said they were heading toward Dry Lake. The man's brow furrowed. He asked if they'd passed by the old farmhouse off the main trail. Eli's stomach tightened. He asked why. The man said some riders had come through earlier. Said they were looking for 2 men, claimed they'd stolen something valuable. They'd offered a reward for any information. The old man stared at Eli, waiting. Mark instinctively took a step back toward the door. Eli forced himself to stay calm. Said they didn't know anything about a theft, just a couple of ranch hands looking for work. The man studied them for a long moment. He didn't seem convinced, but he also didn't seem like the kind who'd sell strangers out for a few dollars. Finally he nodded, handed over the food and muttered, "Those men rode north. Said they'd circle back through here. If you boys are smart, you'll take another road." Eli thanked him. They stepped out quickly. But as they rounded the corner, they heard shouting. A woman was screaming down the street. They ran toward the noise. A young woman in a worn dress was being dragged by two men. Eli recognized one of them, one of Ben's men from the farmhouse. The woman fought, kicking and yelling for help. People stood frozen in doorways, afraid to move. Eli dropped the jar with Mark and started toward them. Mark grabbed his arm, but Eli shook him off. "Let her go," he shouted. The two men stopped and turned. They recognized him instantly. One grinned. "Well, look who wandered right into the trap," he said. He stepped toward Eli, hand on the knife at his belt. Said Ben was looking for them, that there was a good reward on their heads, and they should have stayed gone. Eli didn't move. The other man still held the woman by the arm. She twisted free, kicked him in the leg, and ran toward Eli and Mark. She was shouting for help, yelling that those men worked for the Caldwells, that they were trying to take her against her will. The kicked man cursed and charged after her. Eli stepped in his way. 2 against 2 now, but the Caldwell men had knives. Eli had only his hunting blade. The man smiled, confident. "Easy work," he said, and lunged. Eli sidestepped and shoved him down hard. Mark hurled a rock, hitting the second man's shoulder. Both thugs roared in anger, but before they could recover, the old storekeeper appeared in the street, holding an old shotgun. "Get out of here," he barked. "This town doesn't want Caldwell trash around." The two men hesitated. Doors creaked open. More townsfolk stepped out, not armed, but plenty of them. The Caldwell men backed away, spitting curses. "We'll be back," one warned. With more men. They mounted their horses and rode off. Eli helped the woman to her feet. She was trembling, but her eyes were sharp, defiant. She thanked him, said her name was Rose. Then she asked who they were, and why they'd just gone up against Ben. Caldwell's men. Eli glanced at Mark. They didn't know if they could trust her, but she was being hunted by the same people. Maybe she knew something. He asked why they'd been after her. Rose said it was about land, that she'd been asking questions about a property that used to belong to her family, a ranch the Caldwells now claimed as theirs. She said they'd forged debts to silence her, same as they'd done generations ago. Eli felt a chill run through him. He asked the name of her family. Rose hesitated, eyes darting around the room. Before she could answer, the old man spoke. "You folks better come inside," he said quietly. "Ben'll be back, and when he comes, he'll bring company." They went back into the store. The old man locked the door and doused the, lamps. Rose repeated her question and wanted to know why Eli had asked. About her family. Eli pulled the folded letter from his pocket and handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. She read it slowly, then tears welled in her eyes. She recognized the names. Mary Dors was her grandmother. Jack Perry, her great-grandfather. Everything her grandmother had ever told her. The stolen land, the buried savings, the betrayal. It was all true. Eli said they'd found the jar, that they were heading to Dry Lake to find her. To give it back, Rose couldn't speak, only cried. Mark brought the jar, opened it, showed her the gold and jewelry. She covered her mouth in disbelief. It was real, all of it. The old man peeked out the window, his face hardened. "Hide," he whispered. "Now," Rose froze. "What is it?" He pointed. Horsemen, a dozen of them, riding in fast. At the front, a big man with a beard and a scar down his face. Ben Caldwell was back. And this time he'd brought more men. The old man blew out the lamps. Darkness swallowed the room. Eli, Mark, and Rose crouched behind the counter as hoofbeats thundered outside. The horses stopped. Then came the heavy thud of boots. Ben banged on the door. "Open up," he shouted. No one answered. He slammed the door again. "I know you're in there," he yelled. "I saw my men's horses." "Someone's been meddling in my business." Silence, Ben growled, then kicked the door. The old wood cracked but held. He ordered 2 men to circle around back. Eli looked at the old man. "We need another way out." The old man pointed behind the counter, a trapdoor. It led to a small cellar used for storage with a passage that opened behind the next row of buildings. "Go," the old man said. "Quick." Rose went first, then Mark carrying the jar. Eli helped the old man lift the trapdoor and slipped down just as Ben's boot hit the front door again. The door burst open. Ben stormed inside, shouting. The old man slammed the trapdoor shut and rolled a barrel over it, then climbed the stairs to the second floor, stomping loud, on purpose. Ben followed the noise. "Who's here?" he shouted. The old man played dumb. "Just me, I was asleep. Didn't see nobody." Ben didn't buy it. He ordered his men to search the place, but they found nothing. Below, in the damp dark of the cellar, Eli led Rose and Mark through the narrow tunnel. It was tight, smelled of dust and mold. They crawled until they reached a wooden cover at the other end. Eli pushed. The boards gave way. They climbed out into an alley behind the buildings. The night was black, moonless. Ben's shouts echoed somewhere on the other side of town. They moved quickly, staying low between the shadows. Rose led the way. She knew these back roads better than anyone. They crossed a shallow creek, climbed a low ridge. When they looked back, torches flickered in the distance. Ben's men were already searching house to house. They didn't stop until the town lights disappeared. Completely. Mark asked where. They'd go now. Rose said she had a cousin who lived a day's walk north. They could hide there. But Eli shook his head. "Hiding won't stop him," he said. "Ben's relentless. He'll track us down, and when he does, he'll kill everyone and take that jar." Rose asked what he suggested. Eli said they needed to head for the city, the biggest in the region, El Paso. There they could find a judge, a lawyer, someone not owned by the Caldwells. They could make the story public, bring evidence, show the letter, the jar, everything. Mark said it was suicide. Ben would catch them long before they reached the city. Eli agreed it was dangerous, but it was the only shot they had. Rose stayed quiet for a while, thinking. Then she nodded. Her grandmother had left old documents, deeds that proved the land was theirs. They were hidden at her cousin's house. "If we can get those papers," she said, "and combine them with the letter in the jar, we'll have proof." So that became the plan. They'd go to her cousin's place first, get the documents, then head straight for El Paso. 3 days of walking. 3 days with Ben Caldwell and his men on their trail, but they had no other choice. They started walking again. Behind them, faint against the night, the glow of torches still burned over the town. By the time dawn broke, the sky flared orange and violet over the desert. Rose led the way. She knew every rock, every turn, every secret trail in that harsh land. She'd grown up on her grandmother's stories about the stolen land, about injustice, and how one day someone would finally set things right. They reached her cousin's house at noon. It was small, adobe walls baking in the sun, a dusty yard where chickens scratched at the ground. Rose's cousin, a middle-aged woman named Teresa, went pale when she saw them. Rose explained quickly. Teresa said riders had come by the day before asking about Rose, wanting to know where she was. She'd told them she didn't know, but she could tell they hadn't believed her. Rose asked for the documents her grandmother had left. Teresa went to an old trunk in the bedroom and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were yellowed papers, deeds, contracts, letters from county authorities of the time acknowledging the family's ownership, everything proving the land had been stolen. Eli examined the papers. They were fragile but readable. Along with the letter from the jar and the treasure itself, they made the case solid. Teresa offered food. They ate fast. They knew they couldn't stay long. Ben would show up eventually, and he did. Teresa was handing them water when they heard it. Horses on the road. She looked out the window and saw Ben Caldwell and at least 6 men riding straight for the house. There was no time to run. Eli told Rose and Mark to slip out the back with the jar and the documents. He'd stay. He'd distract Ben long enough for them to get a head start. Mark protested, said they weren't leaving him. Eli insisted. If they all got caught, everything would be lost. Someone had to make it to the city with the proof. Rose pulled Mark by the arm. There wasn't time to argue. They ran out the back toward the trees. Teresa hid the extra plates. Eli sat at the table and waited. Ben pounded on the door. Teresa opened it. He walked in without asking, the others staying mounted outside to keep watch. Ben glanced around, saw Eli, and smiled. Said they'd finally crossed paths again. Called it an interesting chase, but that it was over. Eli asked what he wanted. Ben said he wanted the jar and the names of anyone Eli had told about it. He couldn't let the story spread. Eli said the jar wasn't there, that he'd stashed it somewhere else. Ben stepped closer, said he didn't believe that. Eli kept his face calm and repeated that it wasn't there. Ben looked at Teresa and asked if she knew where it was. She shook her head. Ben sighed, said they'd have to do it the hard way. A shout came from outside. One of his men had found fresh tracks out back. 2 people. Ben understood immediately. He'd been played. He shot Eli a murderous look and said this would cost him. Then he bolted out the door, swung onto his horse, and took off with his men, following the tracks. Eli waited until they were gone, then ran. He had to catch Rose and Mark before Ben did. Rose and Mark were running through the scrub, the jar's weight turning every step into a fight. They could hear the horses behind them, Ben shouting orders, his men fanning out to surround them. Mark tripped on a root and fell. The jar tumbled and rolled. Rose ran back to help him. When they looked up, 3 riders were blocking the trail ahead. 2 more closed in from behind. They were trapped. Ben dismounted slowly, walking toward them with the look of a man who knew he'd already won. He held out a hand for the jar. Rose stepped in front of it. She told him he couldn't bury the truth forever, that people already knew. Ben laughed. Said stories didn't matter without proof. And the proof, he said, was right there in his hands. Then came the shouting. Rolling in from the main road, dozens of voices. Ben turned, confused. One of his men galloped up to him, breathless, saying a crowd was coming. Folks from town, people from neighboring settlements, armed with pitchforks, hoes, lengths of wood. They were looking for Ben. The old storekeeper had spread the word, told everyone about the 2 men who'd risked everything to return a stolen treasure, about the woman descended from a family driven out, about Ben and the Caldwells hunting innocent people. The story had moved like wildfire, and the desert remembered. Many families had been cheated by the Caldwells over the years, had lost land and loved ones. Now there was a chance at justice. Ben realized the math had changed. 6 men against a furious crowd. He ordered his men to mount up and said they'd come back another day. But Rose shouted, pointing at Ben, drawing the crowd's eyes. The people surged forward. Ben and his riders wheeled their horses and fled at a dead run into the brush. Eli arrived, breath ragged. He'd led the crowd there. The old storekeeper was with them, still gripping his old shotgun. He said they'd decided it was time someone stood up to the Caldwells, that they were tired of living scared. Rose hugged Eli, thanked him. Eli said it wasn't over. They still had to reach the city and make it official, but now they had witnesses. Protection. They all went together, a caravan of dozens. Ben didn't dare attack again. 2 days later, they reached the city, El Paso. Rose found a lawyer, a young man who'd studied in the state capitol and come home to help his own. He examined the deeds, the letter, the jar, listened to the witnesses, and said it was the strongest case he'd ever seen against the Caldwells. They filed suit and took everything to a judge. The Caldwells tried to pull strings, sent Ben's men to scare people off, but the crowd protected one another. No one was left alone. The fear that had silenced generations was breaking. The hearings stretched on for weeks, but in the end, the truth won. The judge ruled that the land had been stolen with forged documents. He ordered it returned to Rose and the other descendants and issued warrants for Ben Caldwell, attempted murder, intimidation, fraud. The Caldwells lost everything they'd built on lies. The sentence was read in the town square. The judge declared the land would go back to its rightful owners, Rose and the other descendants found during the case. Ben was led away in cuffs. His men scattered the moment they realized it was over. The Caldwells tried to appeal, but paper records and a chorus of witnesses left them nothing to stand on. Rose returned to the old house with Eli and Mark. She stood in front of the building that had been frozen in time for so many years and said she would restore it, turn it into what it should have always been, a home. Eli and Mark helped, patched the roof, painted the walls, cleared the yard. The house breathed again. Rose used part of the coins to hire workers. She planted where her grandmother had planted. She kept goats in the same pen her great-grandfather had built. Land abandoned for decades began to bear fruit. Other families who'd been pushed out started coming back. The region began to prosper again. Eli and Mark found work on a neighboring ranch. The owner was a fair man who paid honest wages. They didn't get rich, but they had something money couldn't buy: peace. When they lay down at night, they didn't carry the weight of the wrong choice. Eli kept the original letter in a safe place. Sometimes he'd take it out and read it, remembering the words written decades ago, about courage, about justice, about doing what's right when no one's watching. Mark learned that wealth isn't just what you stuff in your pockets. It's being able to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. It's knowing that when the choice came down to greed or justice, he'd chosen right. He visited Rose often, helped with the harvest, played with the kids who now ran laughing through a yard that used to be empty. Ben served his years in prison. The Caldwells lost their land and their influence. The story traveled across the region and became an example. Other families began to challenge old wrongs, to dig up hidden records, to demand what was theirs by right. The fear that had kept everyone quiet for so long was finally losing its grip. Rose married a few years later. She had children who grew up on that land. She told them the story of two men who found a treasure and chose to give it back. How one right choice changed not just a life, but many. The children grew up knowing justice was possible, that courage was real, that the right thing was worth more than the easy thing. Eli and Mark never regretted a thing. When people asked if they missed the money they could have taken, they just smiled. They said they had something better: true friendship, respect, the certainty that when they looked back, they'd see a road worth walking. The house in the desert was no longer forgotten. It was remembered as the place where justice took root again. And the secret those two men uncovered wasn't the treasure in the ground. It was that doing what's right, even when it costs everything, transforms not only those who receive, but most of all those who give. If this story moved you, tap the video on your screen now to hear another unforgettable tale from the American Southwest. Leave a like if this story touched you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and if you can, consider supporting us with a super chat. Every contribution helps us keep telling the stories that honor our shared culture.